When was the last time you had a political or religious conversation that actually felt productive?
It's rare. More often it feels like we're just shouting across this huge moral chasm.
Exactly, and you feel completely alienated from the other person. Well, Jonathan Haidt's groundbreaking book, The Righteous Mind, gives us maybe the most powerful map yet for why this keeps happening.
And that map is absolutely essential. But, we believe that some books, even really important ones, must be challenged. We're not just here to summarize it.
No.
We're here to rigorously critique the claims in the book.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be using a step-by-step critical thinking framework to map Haidt's big ideas back to the evidence.
And we'll also test his conclusions against core ethical principles, look for any logical missteps, and then, only then, try to reach a balanced judgment.
All right.
And just a quick note for you listening right now, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
So let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the core idea that really defines this entire discussion. It's what he calls the intuitionist model. Haidt's central claim, and it's frankly revolutionary, is that moral judgment is overwhelmingly intuitive. It's emotional. He paints reason not as the driver, but as the servant.
Exactly. He has that famous line that reason functions like a press secretary for our gut feelings.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't neutrally search for truth. It gets the verdict from your intuition, from that gut feeling, and then it just scrambles to write a perfectly logical-sounding justification for it.
So if I have this gut reaction that a political candidate is, I don't know, morally wrong,
Yeah.
my brain immediately starts grabbing for evidence, even weak or biased evidence, just to back up that feeling I already have. The feeling comes first.
The justification is always second. And this leads him straight to his explanation for moral diversity. He argues that our morality isn't just built on, say, preventing harm or ensuring fairness.
The things we usually talk about in Western philosophy.
That's it. He says it's built on at least 6 fundamental psychological systems. He calls them the moral foundations.
Right, and it's not enough to just list them. We really need to understand what they do, because this is what explains why political arguments can feel so, well, lopsided. They are. Number 1, care versus harm. Number 2, fairness versus cheating. Then loyalty versus betrayal.
Number 4 is authority versus subversion.
And number 5 is sanctity versus degradation. And finally, number 6, liberty versus oppression.
And what's so fascinating is how these apply. I mean, care and fairness are pretty obvious to most people.
Sure.
But the others are crucial for explaining different moral worlds. Take sanctity degradation. This often explains why issues like flag burning or certain dietary taboos become these moral absolutes, even if they cause no direct physical harm to anyone.
So the moral concern there isn't injury, it's contamination, purity.
Precisely. And then you have loyalty betrayal. That speaks directly to our deep need for group bonds for tribes.
And that deep-seated need to stick together leads Haidt to another really big concept, the groupish human.
Yes. That we are at the same time both selfish individuals and groupish team players.
And he uses that powerful hive switch metaphor to explain how we make that transition.
It's that collective feeling, that moment where the individual ego seems to just melt away. It transforms us from competitive chimps into cooperative bees.
Fusing into a moral community.
Whether it's a religion, a sports team, a nation, or a social movement.
So the big goal of the book is to use this whole psychological picture to explain our political and religious divides. The idea is if we can just understand which foundations our opponents are using,
we can stop seeing them as evil. We can maybe reduce some of that hostility.
Speaking of that psychological wiring, let's map these claims back to the evidence he actually provides. Where does he find support for this whole intuitionist model?
Well, he leans pretty heavily on empirical support from social psychology experiments. He details these studies where people are given morally jarring but objectively harmless scenarios.
Like scrubbing a toilet with your country's flag.
Exactly that. Or eating a piece of cooked roadkill that you know is safe. And people have an immediate, strong moral condemnation. They say, that's wrong.
But they can't explain why.
They can't articulate a rational reason for it. That snap judgment, followed by this confused rationalization, that's powerful support for his press secretary idea.
And then he adds massive survey data to this. This is where the political divide gets really clear. The data seems to suggest that political conservatives tend to draw on all 6 of the moral foundations, including loyalty, authority, and sanctity.
Right, while liberals tend to emphasize primarily care, fairness, and liberty.
And that's the key finding he presents.
It is. But this is where we have to apply our critical scrutiny. We have to ask, just how robust is that evidence? How equals the weight of all 6 of those foundations?
So you're saying that while the work is based on real data, critics argue that maybe not all 6 foundations are equally universal or strong across all cultures.
That's one part of it. The other is challenging an implicit assumption. Haidt sometimes seems to treat the idea of drawing on more foundations as automatically better or more morally complete.
And that doesn't logically follow?
Not at all. It just means you have a wider menu of moral concerns. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a superior moral framework.
And what about the hive switch itself?
Well, that's another point of contention. The social psychological phenomena of group fusion and tribalism. I mean, we see that every day. It's obviously real.
Of course.
But the theoretical reliance on group selection and evolution is still a pretty hot debate among evolutionary biologists. It's a powerful idea, but the biological mechanism is not settled science.
This complexity really forces us to shift into the ethical implications. I mean, Haidt's ethical impulse is appealing. He says liberals, conservatives, and libertarians are all right about their own moral concerns. If you frame that through the golden rule, it's an invitation to really try and understand the moral taste buds of your opponents before you just condemn them.
And that call for empathetic humility is, without a doubt, the book's greatest strength. But critical thinking demands we probe deeper into what you could call ethical asymmetries, meaning Haidt's framework. By just laying out 6 foundations, it kind of risks implying they all carry equal moral weight. And in practice, when applied structurally in a society, that's often not the case.
That's a huge distinction. Understanding a foundation is one thing, but figuring out its just application is something else entirely.
Exactly. When you look at the goals laid out in, say, the U.S. preamble, securing justice, promoting the general welfare, you start to see why simply adding more foundations doesn't guarantee a more just outcome.
Because some foundations can be used to undermine others.
Precisely. Loyalty, authority, and sanctity can be used to justify rigid hierarchy, exclusion, or even oppression. If order or purity under the banner of authority or sanctity leads to discrimination, well, the moral outcome is asymmetrical, and it runs directly counter to justice.
Let's pause there for a quick moment of reflection, which is really the key takeaway of this analysis. The practical value of the righteous mind is not that it tells you which political side is correct, but that it prompts you to ask which moral foundations you personally overuse or neglect in political life. This introspection aligns perfectly with the mission of Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, which offers AI, book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts inspiring reflection and rational thought.
And a rigorous critical thinker always has to probe where a really compelling framework might maybe inadvertently mislead us. Does Haidt overstate how fixed these differences are? Does he downplay the possibility of genuine, slow, rational moral change?
So the tension is between humility and responsibility.
Exactly, between intellectual humility, recognizing how powerful our intuitions are, and moral responsibility, which is the deliberate hard work of arguing and, just as importantly, listening carefully.
Let's go back to the hive switch for a second, because there is an undeniable upside to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Haidt's metaphor really captures that powerful feeling of being swept into something larger than yourself. At a concert, a political rally, a national crisis, it can support incredible sacrifice for the common good.
And it motivates people to care about institutions that are bigger than they are. But this is where that ethical tension has to be confronted. Yeah. Turning people into bees raises some very serious questions that the book doesn't fully resolve.
Such as?
Well, the exact same mechanism that fosters that amazing solidarity and altruism within the group can also intensify outgroup hostility.
Right. It can enforce ideological conformity.
And lead to the rationalization of injustice toward outsiders. It's the other side of that same coin.
Which brings us back to the role of reason, the intellectual framework. If our reason is just a press secretary, how do we ever hold our own group accountable? How do you argue for reform when the hive is just wrong?
That is the critical question. A reading that focuses on the power of human reason has to ask whether Haidt gives enough weight to individual conscience, to our capacity for rational deliberation.
The press secretary model seems to minimize that. It minimizes the potential for an individual to consciously override their gut feelings and argue their way towards justice, even against their own tribe.
It does. And yet, we absolutely have to acknowledge the book's strengths.
Of course.
It models curiosity and empathy. It gives us a clear vocabulary for moral diversity, helping us see that what feels like a pure universal moral truth is often just rooted in our own psychological wiring in our culture.
It's not always objective fact.
But logically, we do have to call out what seems to be the core flaw. Haidt sometimes commits a classic naturalistic fallacy. He moves from the is to the ought. He'll describe the existence or the evolutionary usefulness of a moral foundation, and then imply that its natural presence justifies giving it prescriptive moral weight, the ought.
So just because evolution might have made us value loyalty doesn't automatically mean loyalty should always win out in a moral debate against, say, fairness or care.
Exactly. He blurs description with prescription. And that is a massive logical leap.
So what's a balanced judgment here?
I think our balanced judgment has to be that the righteous mind is a powerful, truly illuminating, but ultimately incomplete map of our moral landscape.
It's indispensable for understanding why our arguments fail so often. It forces you to be humble about your own moral certainty.
It does. But it has to be supplemented by a richer account of how we structure justice, how we use rational deliberation, and how we do the hard work of building institutions that protect both individual rights and our shared goods.
And this comprehensive critique we've been discussing, it relied on structured critical thinking itself. It integrated empirical scrutiny, ethical principles like the Golden Rule, and even constitutional ideals like justice and liberty.
Right. This robust framework is designed to model the very kind of cross-tribal, rational engagement that a book like this encourages. It's all about helping you map claims to evidence and test for consistency, fairness, and logical coherence.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.